So our next speaker is Ms. Diane Earp. In addition to being a fantastic technical project lead on our Catalyze team, she is also the Vice President of Regulatory Compliance at RTI International, providing leadership on corporate initiatives regarding regulatory affairs, quality assurance, and compliance. Diane will be speaking to you today about 3 foundational elements that are critical to your success in product definition and further commercialization of your novel technologies. These elements are defining your technology, its indication, and your end user. With that, I am so pleased to welcome Diane to the floor.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction and the privilege of getting to talk to you all today. I really can appreciate the fact that you've now finished your lunch and it's that time in the afternoon where you're probably already getting kind of tired of the day. So if you doze off, no problem. I won't be offended. I'll try not to take the full 50 minutes in case there are questions. But I wanted to just kind of talk to you about some ways of thinking about research and how translational science plays into products that end up on the marketplace. Next slide, please. So our objectives are really to understand how you can translate your research to a product, defining kind of what your strategic future might look like, not just the product today that you're working on, but a potential business itself through additional products or refinement as you go. Creating your strategy for how do you look and translate to get to meaningful information from the very beginning and early development all the way through, and defining the platform and utility. Sometimes we have to think in terms of what not only the accomplishment or goal is going to be, but how is it going to be made effective or implemented. Next slide. So we start with your targeted objective. Obviously, you are amazing researchers. You've gotten this far. You have an ability to propose conceptually how something might have a meaningful healthcare outcome. You've done research perhaps for decades on a particular subject matter. You are an expert within your field in many cases, in all cases, I would say. And so now you're looking at something that you may be able to translate meaningfully into something that could end up as a diagnostic tool or a kit or an IVD, as we say. A medical device, and that could be something that is used in a variety of different levels and settings, a biologic, a drug, or even an enabling technology. So when we look at setting up a research opportunity, you guys are the experts on this. What I challenge you to do is to think about, so what? If my research proves to be effective, if my objective, my goal gets met, how do I link this research to a longevity that's going to have met a market need or enticed investors or expanded our knowledge base to help us address some of the healthcare issues that our world is facing today and has been for decades. It seems to be never ending. There's always something new out there to deal with. When you think in terms of those goals, you also have to think in terms of what are your venues for paying for this effort of testing something out, feasibility of its potential impact. Even when you get meaningful results, how do you translate that? And there are a number of different entities from public, private, government, clinical, biomedical. There's all these different venues that you can go after that provide you not only grants, but investors, monies to move things forward and to partner with other activities. So today I'm thinking about your research in the terms of translating it to productization and commercialization. So think in those terms. And you just had 2 great PIs talk to you, or 3, I should say, 2 that I work with who have made that jump so seamlessly. Dr. Dunham and Dr. Ting, I've watched and had the opportunity to work with them. And I hear great things about Dr. Gundry's process as well. They've made that translation so seamlessly that I think you can benefit a lot from staying in touch with those guys. They know what they're doing, and I've watched them position and maneuver so effectively over the months that we've been working together that I think they are the poster child for how to do what my presentation is all about. So that even said, we look at the influencers. These are people that kind of identify where the funding needs to come from. Where do we need to go next? Whether it's other researchers, whether it's you proposing opportunities that may not have been considered, our governments, our patients and activists and taxpayers. All of these have a growing, increasing concern that research be oriented towards solutions. And that's kind of the driving, the nuance there. Not just meeting a goal or an objective, but solving a problem. Next slide, please. So translational process or translational science is all around, and I wish I knew this author. While basic research is in the biomedical field seeks to understand, translational research seeks to fix. And I think that is a very profound statement, and that's kind of the driving force behind looking at the basic research, whether it's preclinical studies, animal research, whether you're looking at an epidemiology report and looking for kind of where things are going to go, the basic health analysis and the enabling technologies, all are in this basic research arm that starts the progressive path once you start going into commercialization. So product development starts with basic research. And I know we don't always think of it in that terms, but the sooner you think in that perspective, the sooner you will identify the gaps or the pieces that you need to have in place to really push you forward onto the next phases. Next slide, please. So the indications of use, the evolution here is where things really start getting, where the rubber meets the road here. So when you're in basic research, you're looking for an intended use. And all of these terms have very specific meanings, particularly when you get into the regulated product arena. They have implications for intended use, indications for use, and instructions for use that go way beyond your product going to market. There are in situations where products get into trouble for putting out their marketing and materials in their indications for use or instructions for use that just aren't what they were approved to do. The intended use, using claims that you didn't receive from the regulatory agencies, can really create a serious problem for you as a company. So these are things that you need to start thinking about right up front. When you're in the basic research, what is the objective that you're trying to meet? Is there a value proposition, or what's the purpose? What do you want to do this for? And most of the researchers I've worked with will find that that's one of the first questions I ask. So what do you think you're going to do with this? What do you want it to do? Why are you interested in doing this? That's a question that really is driving to the intended use, and it will evolve over time as you get more meaningful information. As things start to solidify, your intended use may alter just a little bit. And that's kind of the evolution of the translation. Indications for use are in your early phase product development. Now you kind of figured out what you wanted, what its intended use is for. Now the indications for use. What is the disease or the condition that's being diagnosed, treated, prevented, cured, or mitigated? And those are FDA terms. Who will be using the product and why will they use it? So this is where you're driving to kind of the risk profile and what's going to happen with this product and what are you going to need to do to prove what you're saying its indications for use should be. Later on, we get into instructions for use. And this is after you've gotten some clinical studies, you've gotten introduced into humans, and you know what is going to kind of be, its utility will be and kind of where you're heading. Now you look for how will this product be used? A couple of questions I've had for folks is, well, are you going to have this as a home care product where somebody is going to purchase it, bring it home, excuse me, use it on their own? Then your instructions have to be written to a layperson's capabilities. If you're looking for something that's going to be utilized in a hospital or a medical setting, clinic, whatever, a particular entity of a healthcare professional, the instructions need to be written more along that line. So that's where, as you're starting to move through these indications, you get to a point where now you're talking about even the level of your instructions. And that changes tremendously depending on the market you're targeted. Sometimes your product can be targeted for multiple market segments. And in those cases, you may have multiple versions and instructions for use, depending on how it's packaged and which version of the product you're releasing. Next slide, please. So that brings us to defining the platform and the utility. Many times you will find that just in your equipment, there is a challenge. Are we repurposing something that's already out there on the market and is used for other things? Are we using an existing well-established platform where you're just enhancing its utility for something? Or is it innovative and new and something that you're going to have to not only validate and verify, but prove conceptually and with data its value? This comes into and translates to what you see as you go through your prototype development, your validation and verification, and ideas of predicate devices already on the market. One of the first things I encourage folks to do is you've identified what your objective is. You kind of know what you want it to prove that its indications for use are going to be. Now let's go search and see, has FDA already approved this kind of product? What's your risk profile? What's your regulatory strategy going to look like? Because that then lays out the next steps of data development and documentation that you need to create. From a diagnostic capabilities perspective, we need to look at, is it an unmet need? Is there better sensitivity and specificity over existing test systems that are out there? Or are you creating a companion to a drug or medical device use, such that now you have something that's going to be targeting a disease detection, a treatment monitoring, or getting better outcomes? All of these have different trajectories in how you're going forward, what your market will be, what your claims will be, what your regulatory strategy will be. And the sooner you start to solidify that, even in the early development, the better pathway you're going to have, the less likelihood you'll have to repeat information or do additional testing later on. Treatments are another area for defining your platform and utility. Are we going to use is this going to be an over-the-counter use kind of thing, a prescription medication, an in-home care support or hospitalization support? Is it improving the state of the health? Is it directed at a specific disease reduction, either impacting it or eliminating it? Or is it supporting healthcare delivery in some other capacity? All of these are defining your platform and utility. And if you think conceptually at a very high level about that, then the requirements kind of flow naturally out from underneath that. Next slide, please. So now you've kind of gotten all of the ideas of kind of what your product's going to look like, where it's going to fit, kind of what your strategy is for gathering the data and where you're going to go. What are your regulatory considerations? How do you get that competitive edge? And that's what I was talking about earlier. The earlier you start thinking about these things, even if you don't have all the answers, finding those answers as you go along and developing that solidified plan helps you to get that competitive edge. Many of the factors that impact the ability to obtain a quick approval from the agency are around the things we just talked about. And some of the things you want to consider is it going to be a combination product? Is it a device, a diagnostic, or biologic? Defining that categorization up front directs you to the division of the FDA, for example, or even the EMA, that you're going to need to work with to get your product to the market. The primary mode of action, that is a really critical piece of information to get sooner rather than later. And is there another marketed product that's similar? So what we were talking about, what the FDA refers to as a predicate device. Does the product address an unmet medical need in the market? That's always really critical. And that kind of elevates you up there. When you're doing something that hasn't been done before, then you're meeting an unmet need, and the agency tends to prioritize the level of interest in that regard. What level of control is needed to ensure it's safe and effective? This is your risk profile, your hazards analysis, and kind of what are the adverse reactions you're seeing, the negative effects of what you're working through. This comes into play very early with your toxicology studies, your animal studies, the dosing, figuring out exactly where that sweet spot is with your enhanced capabilities to meet a medical need versus negative impacts of the disease. Think about it when you hear, I love these commercials where they talk about, our product, eliminates cold symptoms, but it can create, nausea, dizziness, death. So really, is that really, you got to think about what those negative effects are and whether or not the value add is there. How will the product be classified and regulated by the regulatory agencies? Really based on a lot of these questions up above. And that's where you're determining whether or not you've got a 90-day path to clearance. Are you going to be able to go straight to market because it's a class 1 device and you have GMP manufacturing in place? Or is it going to be a projected timeline that's going to take years to get through clinical studies and phase 3 anecdotal data, so that, or not anecdotal, but objective data that you can use to assure the agency that your drug can come to market. You know, a couple years ago, I got to work on a product. I was as one of the regulatory support that had been in play for 19 years. And it's an orphan drug, met an unbelievable need of people who were dying and had no other recourse. And they're now able to be better in a matter of months. So, you know, that's those kind of things. The more substantive your product design is, the longer it's going to take to get it out there. So it's not always a fast track to the market. Sometimes it's something that's going to take a protracted timeline to actually get it there. So I don't want to make you think that this is really easy. You just decide up front and it's done. It really depends on what you're working toward. Next slide, please. So I would encourage you, as you start through your process, and those that have worked with me have seen me do this, once you kind of get an idea of what you think you want to do and you really feel comfortable with it, take advantage of the FDA's processes, pre-submissions, the questions, an ability to engage with them early on can be so valuable to you as a researcher. They're interested in what you're doing. They want to help you have a clear path of what they consider is needed to get your product to market. So the earlier you can engage with them, once you've got meaningful information, the better. I would encourage you to be ready to go to the agency when you get out of the initial preclinical testing. You've got your prototype defined, or you've got enough information to kind of show that you're ready to move on into the clinical aspects of your product. Talk with them first. It's never too early to engage with the FDA. Get either in person, in writing, or on a teleconference to get them on board with where you are headed and ask them the meaningful questions. Does this fit this? Do you concur with our strategy, or do you believe this will be adequate to support a clearance? They won't give you a yes or a no, but they will give you their perspective based on what you've shared with them. So I encourage you to always stay engaged with the FDA. A lot of people have said to me, I don't want to talk to the FDA, I'm a researcher. Well, they are researchers too, in essence, and they'd love to engage with you to kind of understand where you're going and what you have, and they will give you very good advice. I would encourage you to be careful what you ask for, because once they give you that advice, they expect you to follow it. Disagreeing with the agency, from my perspective, is not healthy. And although, unless you have a very, very meaningful set of data that they may not have seen and that could change their perspective, I would encourage you to work with them hand in hand, because that's the key to getting your product to market quickly. Next slide, please. So I promised you guys I wouldn't keep you too late, but once you've got past, we're moving along pretty quickly here. Once you've got past the basic research, you kind of have data, you've got the prototype, you kind of feel like you know what you're going into. Then you move into the next phases of the clinical research, which is the controlled observational human studies, or in some cases, access to samples that give you more testing values, the data. You need to establish quantifiable information that's going to objectively meet the needs of what you have to do to go through this translation. You've got the who, the what, the why, and the how. Now you've got to define the strategy and goals going forward. And so now you invariably, they're going to change over time, but your intended use gets you to this regulatory pathway. And now you're here, you're moving forward now into gathering the data that's needed to make that regulatory submission. And in fact, you may just be getting expanded claims on something that already exists out there. You may be actually looking at prolonged phase 4 post-marketing commitments, but that's not something that should distract you. When you get to this point in your translation, you're now ready to start moving into a real commercialized product. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. We're going to focus on the front end. So let's change. Next slide, please. Change direction a bit. I could go on and on about that. So the elements of a good productization strategy. This gives you your competitive edge. Define the risk profile of your success or failure and the competitive market as early as possible so that you kind of know, if I build this thing, if I create this product, is it going to have a life? You know, unfortunately, there are research projects that are very successful in their outcomes, but when you look at what they've created, there is no market for it. It's either too expensive, too complicated, or it doesn't meet a need out there. And so success on one end from a research perspective may not actually be a success on the other end, which is a translation into product. Review and apply your regulations and guidelines. As I said before, engaging with your regulatory agency, working with them throughout the development and implementation of your product, starting with your preclinical test results, your feasibility. Once you get past that, now you're ready to start talking with them about what other data gathering strategies or stages do you need, and quantifiably, in particular for medical devices, where it really gets kind of dicey, is you think you need X number of values, and the agency comes back with a significantly different viewpoint. You want to have come to an agreement with that early on before you start actually engaging in those studies. Ensuring adequate timelines for completion. This is something I've seen a lot of commercialization efforts fail. They get their investors in line, they get the information, the company's set, they're ready to go, but they fail to understand that this is not going to go to market in 6 months. It's a protracted timeline that's going to take a couple of years perhaps to get approval to release to the market. And so building that into your commercialization strategy as a part of the development life cycle is important. It can be a showstopper when there's unrealistic expectations. You know, you can't force the agency to give you a clearance when they're looking to give you an approval. That takes much longer, requires more data. And if you misjudge that and you haven't concurred with the agency, then you may be misleading your company's strategy and not develop enough resources and timeline in there to be successful. Communicating openly and frequently, I think I beat that horse to death. Monitoring the market and protecting your IP. You know, as researchers, I've always heard the publish or perish concept is out there, but that doesn't always work in your favor when you're looking to commercialize a product. I've seen folks publish all their data, publish their conceptual design, publish the information. They get credit for the publication and somebody grabs it and runs with it. So you want to make sure that you're protecting your IP, both through recognition that it is your IP and it belongs to you, but also by how you share the information. It's a fine line when you're talking to investors or particular companies that are out there that are interested in your product, what you tell them and what you give them and under what kind of agreements protects you and your IP as you move forward. So it's the pitches that you go out for, you got to be careful. You want to get them interested, but you don't want to give them enough that they can go off and do it without you. Ensure budget, resources, and timelines for your product development cycle are consistent with your regulatory classification and the approval process is what we were just talking about. That can get out of kilter very quickly. Depending on how your claims change. You know, I think you heard Dr. Dunham talking about, and Dr. Ting talking about how they maybe started to rethink what their initial claims might be and what their focus would be in order to move to market faster. And that's one way of dealing in a strategy to get you to commercialization faster. You may know that your product has capabilities that are far beyond what you initially want to introduce it for, but that is your strategy for further development, and it gets you to the market quickly. Your company's market and sales projections have to be aligned with your regulatory strategy. If your company is expecting to have the product out there and for sale in 12 months, and you have a regulatory timeline that is up to 2 years, something's going to give, and it could be the demise of your product line. So these are pretty important things to consider. Next slide, please. So this is something I ran into. I wish I knew kind of how to say this better, but as researchers, your pursuit of truth, the pleasure of using your mind, the sense of achievement from discovery, and the recognition that you get from your peers, that's what matters as far as I can see. But I love this next line. That doesn't mean that you'll turn down money if it's given to you. So looking at your research and letting it grow into a product, and even if it means selling it to someone else, focus on not only the money that you're going to make, but the problem you have solved in the healthcare arena. That's what your research is all about, I think. And with that, I will thank you. And I've given you, next slide, a list of references that you might find helpful. Next slide, please. These are the places to go to look for the regulations for markets that may impact your product lines. I'm a regulatory affairs person. I always have to give those out. And the couple of articles that I saw that were quite interesting, I thought you might find interesting as well. And with that, I'll open up to any questions you might have or comments. Is everybody asleep now?
How interpret these documents, these websites? I've seen some of these regulations run like 400 pages, and do you just like need a lawyer to boil it down into something real for you, or can you actually figure it out yourself?
I would suggest to you as a researcher, it's important that you probably want to have someone who has a regulatory nature to be able to at least guide you to those regulations that are applicable to what you're doing. And that comes once you've decided kind of what we were talking about in this presentation. When you got a feel for where you're headed with this and what you think you want it to do, consult with a regulatory affairs person, whether it's us or, there are lots of consultants out there who has a specialty in this particular area, whether it's a medical device, a biologic, a drug, and have them provide you with what are the more relevant pieces of information. Once you dive into that and you get those guidance documents, those set of regulations, they're pretty straightforward. It's not rocket science. It's pretty, just knowing how to dive through those regulations though, and getting to the ones that apply. The important thing for you though is to get a documented regulatory strategy. That's something that you put with your business plan. And as things shift and change, you go back to that strategy and say, does it need to change as well? So it's kind of a good checkpoint, and it's worth the time to get that documented.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Anything else from anyone?
Yes, I have a question, Diane. My name is Andrei Komisarov. I work in the middle of Texas, Tyler, Texas, University of Tyler. And I have rather philosophical question about this different focuses of fundamental and applied science. Could you, if we think about history, say we take an example of the Manhattan Project, right? Manhattan Project was combined two branches to produce a product which actually stopped World War II and saved life, right? And we're talking about 1942, I believe, to 1945.
Okay, that's a little before my time, but okay.
Yes. Now switch the gears. Now we have a COVID-19 problem. And in this case, in 3 years, we lost more than a million people in the United States, which is more than any war we ever had. Could you somehow comment what is the reason why we are number one in the COVID losses, and we are number one in creating on stopping World War II? What do you think? What does it differ between? What is the difference between these two projects, which resulted in what we have? Thank you.
That's a really interesting question, and one I could talk about all day. I actually wrote a paper recently on the strategic impact of COVID-19 on leadership in the healthcare environment. And I think it was a combination of things. It was a situation where the regulatory platform has obviously been better established or more well established since 45. You were in the United States also in the middle of a political transition, which changes a lot of the leadership of our healthcare delivery system. And they were all in the midst of getting that shifted over about the same time that a crisis hit that was, as you said, of world impact. So you had a lot of confusion between who was leading what and what needed to be done, and an emergency use authorization process that had not been in play before, that was able to get things out quickly, but without the checks and balances that our productization requires under normal circumstances. It created quite a bit of chaos. In the midst of all of this, with our leaders of our healthcare shifting over to new people, we were also all being faced with, and the only way to deal with this is to go home. So our systems were being impacted. Our ability to engage and talk and share was being shifted a little bit. We were going to tele-remote work. Our laboratories were shut down periodically to figure out what to do next. So you had a lot of economical and political and new systems that were all clashing at once. I think it's going to be interesting to see as this pandemic rolls on, kind of how it resolves itself. One of my first questions was, we've never used the emergency use authorization process to this quantifiable level before. How do we get out of that? You know, how are we getting back to reality and getting these products that were thrown out there quickly through the regulatory processes for approvals and continued use? Or do we just pull them off the market? We can't do that. They're being relied upon. So we're still in a lot of evolution. The agency had so limited resources to throw at this. And when I say agency, I mean FDA as a part, just one piece of that, that it just continues to manifest itself. I think they're still working through, at least the people I talk to, they're still working through their backlog of routine documents that were coming in during all of the emergency use authorizations. So it created an unprecedented strain on the healthcare delivery system. And I personally think, and not because this is Catalyst funded by NIH, but I think our NIH institutes did a phenomenal job of being a voice of reason while all this was going on, and working hand in hand with the FDA. So we had a lot to learn from this. We've had a lot of experiences that I wish everyone didn't have to go through. But I think that's why it was a little different. And I think that's why we're still scratching our heads and going, how do we change this trajectory if it ever happens again? And there's a big effort being pushed forward. ARPA-H is one of the initiatives I'm aware of. There's a couple of others. And even Catalyst is an example. How do we fast track things to get through the processes, get the data that we need quickly, and make decisions fast? And like you heard earlier, this is one way of pulling all of the resources to bear, so that you as a researcher, you've got a concept, you've got people there that can talk to you about commercialization, they can talk to you about regulatory, they can talk to you about preclinical work. What do you need to help you get all of the pieces together quickly? I think that's the key to the future success.
So you think it's time? That's time and this coordination, and you hope that everything will be fine. Because I know, as a researcher, I know it came to the, and I know what I'm talking about, came to the new type of PI in residence for some time.
Yeah. Our researchers have been our saving grace all over the world. You are the entities that found, how do we get vaccines out there? How do we get things done? So all of your support systems that you need to be effective have learned to rally in the last 3 years. And I like to say very positive, to help. Not everything has worked, I know that, but we've learned how to better combine our efforts to support researchers to move faster to get their their realities put out there quicker. And I think that's been the gain here. The loss has been the deaths and the time it took. It's unfortunate, but you know, I always try to look at, we learn something from every situation. And I think that's been one of the value adds that we've seen. I've watched agencies that didn't talk together unite and start supporting one another. I've been in situations in my career where I had a state law that contradicted a federal law so I couldn't make couldn't get anybody happy. We don't see that as much anymore. We see a collaboration and a defined swim lanes so that everybody is working together. So, I try to look at it as a positive thing. I think that's one of the things we've gained out of this.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you.
I hope you agree.
Yes, I think, and if I may, I think that Catalyze is a great opportunity to actually start new approach to the development of the product, and we see how it happens. So that's a good point. Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
My pleasure. Anyone else?
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. That was a really wonderful and informative presentation as always.